Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, just a couple of housekeeping comments before we start. The session today is going to be recorded, and it is going to be up on the SAEON YouTube channel sometime after that. So as long as everyone's happy for that, we can continue. Right, so it's our next installment of the SAEON Seminar series. And I just would welcome everybody, but I would really like to especially welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Hayley Clements. Just a little bit of background about Hayley. I needed to keep this short because I could have spoken for 15 minutes just about Hayley's achievements, but here's kind of a summarized version. Hayley is an interdisciplinary conservation scientist who applies social ecological systems thinking to identify resilient and equitable conservation opportunities in a changing world. She completed her PhD in 2016 at UCT and looked at the role of social ecological drivers in private conservation lands in South Africa. She then undertook a postdoctoral fellowship looking at the effectiveness of protected areas in Australia and resilience indicators for a second postdoc through Stellenbosch University. Staying at Stellenbosch, she worked through the Centre for Sustainability Transitions, where she now holds a senior research position and an Oppenheimer-Jamma research chair in African wildlife economies. At the core, her research explores how African biodiversity connects to human well-being and explores the role of African wildlife economies in achieving just and sustainable development. Hayley serves on the steering committee of the African Wildlife Economy Community of Practice, is a member of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, the Society for Conservation Biology, and the Society for Social Ecological Systems. In 2021, she was a content contributor and editor to the Routledge Handbook of Research Methodologies for Social Ecological Systems, and in 2023 was a lead on the chapter Social Ecological Systems Thinking and Biodiversity under the thematic heading of Humans and Their Effects in the Encyclopedia of Biodiversity. Today, Hayley is going to be sharing some of the very nice fruit from some recent ambitious work that she's been working on, developing a Biodiversity Intactness Index for sub-Saharan Africa. Proud to say several SAEON staff, SAEON honorary associates, and some SAEON local and international collaborators were part of the contributors to the project. Before I hand over to Hayley to take us through that, I do just need to kind of mention that the work behind the presentation was published by the Nature Publishing Group in the journal Scientific Data in 2024, and that was followed up by a publication that made the cover of the journal Nature in 2026. And all this happened while Hayley raised 2 kids. But yeah, so just jot down your comments or your thoughts or pop them into the chat, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. And then in the chat, I've also put some links to some of the published and the data resources that Hayley will be touching on today. So without any further ado, Hayley, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dave. I feel like that was a very generous introduction. Dave and I were just joking before everyone got let in that, I like to claim this project took 6 years because it was so hard, and it was hard, but it did also have 2 children along the way. So I thought that was an entertaining bit to add. But I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to speak to SAEON and your broader network about this work, and I see many familiar faces also of experts that participated that have joined this presentation. So that's very nice to see as well. Thank you for coming. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, Dave, can I have a thumbs up? Can you see my first slide? Okay, great. Okay, so I guess to start with why we did this, and I mean, I think this I don't need to spend much time on because I'm preaching, really to the choir here, but we know that we're failing to mitigate biodiversity loss, and I think that is for many reasons, but one is that we really are struggling to effectively mainstream biodiversity into decision making at the various scales in which we need to do that. And of course, that's not an easy task. Like, how do you take the complexities of biodiversity and functioning ecosystems and measure them in ways that is standardized, is scale flexible, into intuitive ways that actually can be used in decision-making tools at national and even international scales. And I think increasingly there's a focus on measuring ecosystem condition or integrity. We see that in the first goal of the global biodiversity framework. And I think, people are increasingly thinking about measuring biodiversity in those ways because it gets us closer to understanding through ecosystem condition, what is the condition of ecosystem functions, services, and ultimately, the relevance to our societies and economies. And I think that one of the kind of metrics that's put forward as a useful one to capture some of these complexities around biodiversity and get us closer to understanding condition is the Biodiversity Intactness Index. So what the Biodiversity Intactness Index is the average impact of human land use activities on the abundance of diverse species in a region relative to a reference state. And I think some of the reasons that this is an attractive indicator is, again, because it's not just about presence, absence, or level of threat. It gets at changes in abundance, which is, of course, important for ecosystem functioning. It tries to capture those changes in abundance across a diverse suite of species to tell us something about the ecosystem as a whole. And because it's relative to a reference, it's kind of on a scale of 0 to 1, which makes it quite scale flexible and standardized. So you can report the biodiversity intactness of a municipality or a country or a region or even theoretically the world. Now, the trouble with indicators like this is how do you actually measure them in ways that is consistent? And so, obviously we need to know where all the species are is the one thing. We need to know what are the land uses in across the landscape. And then we also need to know, and that's the hardest bit, like how do those land uses impact on the species that are there relative to what would have been the case pre-colonial or pre-industrial. And so some of the ways that people have tried to do this is by looking to databases that have tried to collate field data from across the world on biodiversity or species abundance across many sites across the world. And this is one that many of you may be familiar with. It's called the Predicts database. And I think what's particularly challenging for something like the BII is that you need this data. You need it for a transformed landscape, some sort of human land use, like cropland or urban, but you also need like a comparator relative to what? Like if we see, 5 of one species here, what is that as a proportion of what should be there? And so this database uses contemporary proxies like protected areas or wilderness areas where people have counted species in that landscape, the intact landscape, and then a transformed landscape. But of course, what you can see on this map is massive regional biases and where the effort in how much data has been collected, which then has an influence when you try to use this data to predict biodiversity intactness across the world. And of course, what you can't see here is that these databases also have taxonomic biases. For example, they're quite biased to birds, which we know in many cases are actually a bit more resilient to land use change. And the implications of this can be quite severe. So I think many of you will look at this map. So this is a global map of biodiversity intactness, which was actually published in Science a decade ago, and think that this just doesn't look right. In many cases, I think it's almost like the opposite of what you'd expect. And I think what we're seeing here is really like a bias towards more forested ecosystems, really the more open rangeland systems being penalized. Exactly why this is, I'm not entirely sure, but this is based on the Predicts database. And I think it comes down to these global models conflating pastureland grazing lands that are quite intensive and happening in transformed landscapes in places like Western Europe, with rangeland, which of course is what happens across much of sub-Saharan Africa, in less transformed systems, on natural grazing lands. So, and then these models get fed into various multilateral fora. Countries are expected to use things like this to evaluate progress towards targets, etc. So these global, very sophisticated models can have like quite severe implications. And this has been pointed out by some papers, but they continue to be used, to be mainstreamed into many fora. And this is another one, a more recent one that also tries to map biodiversity intactness. This isn't even in a published paper. It's on the Google Earth Engine community app, and you actually can't even tell what the methods are behind this model. And really, I think those global models, they risk, in their sophistication, they risk a lack of understanding of context of the local landscapes in which biodiversity interacts with people. And so we tried to do something quite different in this project. We tried to say, okay, maybe, there is actually a lot of data across Africa, but maybe it's not standardized and available in the forms to be used in these fancy global models. But that doesn't mean there's not a wealth of expertise, people working across the region as researchers, museum curators, field guides, etc., that actually have really deep knowledge of certain groups of species and how they are being impacted by the changes that we see across those landscapes. And so for this project, we took a different approach where we said, can we take the complexity of that place-based knowledge that people hold and somehow translate it into quantitative data that can then feed into a model of biodiversity intactness instead of these fancy global models. And so that's really what led us to this project. Of course, I could not do that by myself. I'm not an expert in each of these groups of species. We focused on vertebrates and plants for this exercise, also acknowledging the limitations of that, but that's where we started. And I also didn't have networks across the continent. And so I reached out to people that do have such expertise, and in some cases also such networks, to help me think through how we would do this and how we would reach out to additional experts that would be willing to get involved across the region. And it was a lot of effort to find all of you that are here today and others. And this is a summary of how we did. So it's kind of remarkable that we ended up on 200 experts. That wasn't by design. And we really wanted to get as much African expertise as we could, while also recognizing that there is expertise of African biodiversity that is held with people sitting elsewhere in the world. And we certainly did not do a perfect job. You'll see here we have a strong bias towards experts that are knowledgeable in Southern Africa, and in particular, that's a bias towards South African experts. Of course, we're here, so that leans into our networks. But it's also, it was quite challenging trying to find, for example, experts from Central and West Africa. There were language limitations, and also, it wasn't easy to try and find like email addresses for the people we found. Our bird expert, for example, Lee Siobhan Reynolds, got hold of all the emails for bird life across every country in Africa and emailed them all asking who would participate. So different leads, did it in different ways. And you'll also see here, of course, there's not perfect representation across the groups. We found very much when it came to, for example, larger mammals, people had expertise across fewer species versus, for example, herpetologists. Many of them could speak across, the several thousand species of reptiles and amphibians, and for plants, especially, they're underrepresented in terms of the ratio of experts relative to species. So, lots of ways I think we could have done this better, but 200, to wrangle 200 was quite a task in of itself. And you can actually go onto the BII for Africa website. If you scan that QR code, it will take you there, and you can learn about the experts that contributed. And I think that this ended up being actually one of the like, I guess, outputs of the project that I'm most proud of, because it's just, I really think it showcases African biodiversity expertise in a really nice way. And I still get like nice emails from people saying, oh, I found my long lost colleague from university. Like, please, can you put me in touch with them? Or I get people saying, I'm looking for experts in like mountainous regions in East Africa. Can you help? And so it has been really like a nice network to have built. Okay, so then in terms of what we asked everybody to do, this itself was conceptually very challenging. So firstly, there are tens of thousands of species of plants and vertebrates across the continent or the region, and we couldn't possibly ask experts to think about all of them. So the first thing we did particularly first with the lead experts, but then also bringing in the rest of the expert group, is to think about, could we group species into what we called response groups, or they're kind of functional groups, but they're more response groups, like groups of species that we would expect to respond in a similar way to human land use, and then ask experts to think about, to estimate how that group of species would be impacted by different land use activities across the continent. And this very much varied on the group. So for example, for bats, it was decided that where they roost has the most important influence on how they respond to human pressure. For amphibians, it was where they breed. For plants, that was really hard, and we kind of landed on something that was how they respond to disturbance, things like grazing and fire, and also how tolerant they are to shade. Then we also had to translate this infinite number of combinations of human land use activities that you could see across the region into archetypes, or kind of real characteristic landscapes that represent broadly what's happening across the region that our experts could understand. And we came up with 9 of those, which we described in quite detail to the expert group. And then what we asked the experts to do was to estimate these intactness scores. So what would be the average abundance of one of these, of the species in one of these groups in one of our landscape types relative to what would have been there pre-industrial, and to give that a score from 0, like nothing remains, to 1, no, they're actually completely still fine in that landscape, or even above 1 if they actually respond positively to human intervention. And of course, what we're doing here is translating like expert opinion into data. And this is actually a whole field of science in terms of how do you rigorously do an expert elicitation to convert opinion into data. And so we followed what's called a modified Delphi approach, where you bring the group of experts together. We did it per kind of broad taxonomic group, like the herpetologists were together, large mammal ecologists together, etc. And then we explained to them what we wanted them to do. And then they had 2 weeks to go and make these estimates per species group and land use independently, drawing on whatever information they wanted to. And then we brought them back together and showed them the aggregated results to discuss. So this kind of group discussion to really interrogate like the trends we're seeing, the outliers, why that might be, and also how people had maybe struggled with the certain aspects or assumptions they had to make, etc. And the feedback was from the experts is that was kind of the nicest part of this, was actually having the opportunity to learn from their peers. And then based on that discussion, they could have a second round to revise any of their scores if they wanted to. And that then became aggregated into this BII for Africa data set. This just gives you a little example of what those kind of estimates look like. So this is the mean and the confidence interval across experts, estimating how different response groups of bats and amphibians would respond to an intensive rangeland landscape that we described there. And so you can see here, differences in response, but also, for example, groups like the amphibians that breed in ephemeral flowing water, where there was actually like a lot more uncertainty reflected in the expert group and how they may respond. And so these scores are now in this rather substantial open access data set that, as Dave mentioned, I co-authored with all the participating experts that wanted to be part of that. And this was kind of the foundation for estimating the Biodiversity Intactness Index, but we also really hope that this is a resource that can be used, for many other endeavors to parameterize models, etc. And again, I think this is, a really nice kind of showcase of African expertise, and provides some, some data that these global models also should hopefully use. But then what we had to do in this project was to take those expert estimates of how different human land uses impacted on the abundance of different species and map it. So to do that, we had to know where the different species were. We used the IUCN range maps for vertebrates and for plants. That was really tricky. So we used published species richness per ecosystem, ecoregion estimates, combined with another expert elicitation on the proportional abundance of different response groups of plants across that proportional abundance. I'm not going to get into that, but even making the map of where the land use activities were across the continent was a whole other endeavor that I hadn't anticipated, because of course, like land cover is easier in some sense because you can see it from space to some degree. So, we got lots of maps, for example, of crop cover. But for this purpose, it's not very helpful to just know about crop cover. We also need to know what is the intensity of that crop cover. And so, in an African context, for example, whether something is smallholder cropland or commercial cropland monoculture has quite a substantial difference in terms of its impacts on biodiversity. So we used like a really cool citizen science layer that had estimated field size. We also layered over nitrogen input as a measure of intensity to basically come up with our own map of cropland intensity, where the kind of highest intensity and lowest intensity were two landscapes that we described for experts, so that we could also interpolate their scores in between. And then, of course, we had to do that for the other major land covers as well. Rangelands also was really challenging to figure out how to do that well. I'm sure many of you will know, that's not something you can see from space, like the integrity of a rangeland system. And so what we used was a kind of a proxy of intensity. We used the gridded livestock of the world data, overlaid or binned into different rainfall and soil nutrient areas to ascertain high intensity versus low intensity rangelands. This, I feel, is like the biggest uncertainty area in the map, and something that really needs to be improved. But based on the data sets we had, that was kind of the best we could do. So then we had, the BRI for Africa data set, plus kind of species composition, and this map of land use and intensity, which we could use to map biodiversity intactness across the region. And because, this isn't like a black boxy model, and it's kind of built from the bottom up, that also means we can disaggregate it in many different ways. So I'll just show you a couple of those now. First, we can disaggregate it by the different groups, and we can disaggregate all the way to a response group level, but just to show you kind of the high level trends here. So things that stand out here is that plants tend to be more resilient to human activity than vertebrates. But there was some interesting nuance here as well. For example, this certainly holds in a lot of the like less transformed ecosystems like rangelands, but in heavily transformed, for example, croplands, actually some of the vertebrates do better than plants, which I think also, it makes sense. We also see, for example, trees and shrubs have been a lot less resilient than forbs and graminoids. And amongst the vertebrates, we were a bit surprised that amphibians, we thought that might score lower, but I think the big reason that the mammal scores like quite substantially lower is because of this very big size differential in mammals and how heavily impacted many of the large mammals are. So you can see that here. So this is a lot to look at, but this basically breaks the BII up to the level of the response groups. And basically, like a brief summary here is like, as things get bigger, they tend to be much less resilient to or worse impacted by human land uses. We also see as things are more specialized, they tend to be more impacted, and things that are dependent on trees or shade, in the case of plants, also tend to be more impacted. And then you can also look at this spatially across different biomes, and you can also try and understand like what are the kind of land uses that are really driving these changes. And so, I mean, I think it will be no surprise to many of you here that fynbos has been the worst impacted in terms of losses in biodiversity intactness, grasslands as well, compared to some of the savannas and more arid regions. And that has a lot to do with land transformation in those systems, but also some interesting difference. So, for example, fynbos, has been very heavily impacted by commercial kind of high intensity agriculture and also rangelands. Versus in the savannas, we see a lot more smallholder cropland contributing to those losses. And then in some of the other biomes like desert, shrubland, forest, it's really a lot of the degradation of the natural ecosystems, overharvesting, things like that have caused the major losses. And then I'm not going to show it here, but you can also disaggregate this by species group to really understand what's the most badly affected by different land uses or in different biomes. I thought I'd also just show it quickly by country. So this is the average biodiversity intactness of each country. And we've plotted this against the extent to which that country is transformed, where the major transformed land cover is cropland, but of course also urban areas, plantations, things like that. And then I've plotted like what the linear model would look like. So you can see there's an obvious linear relationship. As your country becomes more transformed, you have a lower BI, that's obvious, but there's also interesting variation around that, which has to do, I think, both with how intensive that transformed and untransformed land is used, but then also what species you have in your country, which also depends on the biome, etc., and how susceptible they are to those changes. So, for example, like I said, forest species are very susceptible to transformation because, of course, it's structurally a complete change of the ecosystem. And so forested countries that are highly transformed have lost a lot more biodiversity than a more open a country with more open ecosystems. And there's South Africa sitting at about 72%, and slightly less biodiversity intact than you would expect given the extent of transformation in the country. So then I think, one of the kind of the high level messages that came out of this, and the extent of it actually surprised me, is if we just look at the total proportion of wild plants and animals that still exist across the continent relative to what should be there. The vast majority of those are in rangelands and near natural lands, so untransformed lands where people also exist. And also a bulk of it is in croplands, and that's really because of their extent across the region. Far less in protected areas, and that certainly doesn't mean they're not important. They're super important, especially for large mammals. But really the message here is that if we're going to curb biodiversity loss, we can't only be engaging, with the protected area model. We really need to be engaging in these landscapes where people coexist with biodiversity. And of course, cropland is one of those. And this plot shows you the distribution of pixels across the region in terms of the intensity of the cropland. And what you see here is really still a skew towards less intensive croplands across Africa. That probably also won't come as a surprise. But so some really big questions there about, whether we go this way in terms of intensifying those croplands, which, has a big impact on biodiversity intactness in those locations, but it also means we don't transform more land, which, smallholder croplands have less of an impact on biodiversity, but compared to a natural area, that impact is still huge. And so, of course, this is the classic land sparing, land sharing debate, but this data set can really be used to kind of interrogate some of those questions. And then, of course, I keep mentioning rangelands, but that's a big one. Like that's, the hugest land use across the region. And so what happens in those rangelands going forward is going to be really, I think, the biggest determinant of what happens to our remaining biodiversity intactness. And as Dave mentioned initially, I now focus quite a lot in the field of wildlife economies, trying to understand if those economies, things like ecotourism, hunting, etc., can actually present an opportunity in these landscapes to sustain livelihoods and development, but also biodiversity. I will just briefly mention how do we know that this map is any good? And I'm sure you all have opinions on that. And that was also an interesting exercise, working with the experts, because of course everybody knows their group of species in the landscapes where they work intimately. But how that aggregates into a map, of everything may look quite different to what you have expected. And that's just and it's uncomfortable for many people. And then of course, like how do we check that this aggregate of everything, what emerged as a whole, is actually true? And that's really difficult because it's hard to know what to compare it to, especially when the things you could compare it to are also flawed in many ways. And so I think ultimately what we really need is some good ground truthing, which, hopefully that can spur that on. But just to show you some examples, so the paper I mentioned that really critiqued the global BII, basically what it did was it said, look, the BII, of course, it captures a lot more in complexity than something like a human footprint index, because it captures how biodiversity actually responds to the human footprint. But you should see a general correlation, whereas the human footprint is more, biodiversity is less. And they basically showed you don't see that at all, which is probably unsurprising to many of you in the room based on the picture I showed you. But obviously that's concerning. And the same for the other one is the biomass modification index. And so we ran those same analyses and showed okay, ours at least does show you what you would expect. But of course, the variation is also interesting and important. And those red circles show you biodiversity hotspots. And we also showed that they tended to have a lower BII, which is also reassuring. And then we also, through the review, which really interrogated us for 2 years, such that the validation part of the Nature paper is like half the results. But what we also ended up doing is looking for each vertebrate species across its range, what is the BII of its response group, and then looking at whether there was any relationship between IUCN threat category and the BII. And we found reassuringly that there was quite a solid relationship where least concerned species tended to have higher BII, endangered species much lower, etc. So we have, some reassurance that this map is telling us some truth. But of course, we talk about in the paper how this was a contextualized generalization. We were trying very much to capture more of the place-based knowledge that's really important to biodiversity, but at the same time translate that into a regional map. Not a global map, but a regional map. So still accounting for a lot of the regional nuance, but of course a lot of the real nuance is lost in that process. And that, again, that's like an uncomfortable tension that is necessary if you want to produce something across the region. So maybe just to conclude by saying we made a Google Earth Engine app, so that this data can hopefully be more usable. You can look for a certain country, you can download bits of it, etc. And then also not to lose sight of the experts that really underpin this map. And so we also produced a Google Earth Engine story. Ultimately, I'd like these two to be overlaid, but we're still figuring out how that can be possible. But so our map is not a black box. You can go to this Google Earth Engine story and you can click on all those little dots across the region and learn about the experts and what they do and what they're seeing as changes in those landscapes where they work. Oh yes, I wanted to very briefly say where to next. First, I had to recover from this very difficult task, but one of the things that we're now doing, working with SANBI, the South African National Biodiversity Institute, is actually to downscale the map to South Africa. Because we did this regionally, we needed land cover data sets and species distribution data sets that were available across the continent. But of course, in South Africa, we have very good national scale data. And so we're working with some of that data to still use the BII for Africa expert scores, but to map them based on some national data sets. And then I think what's really interesting to me now is like, what can we learn from BII and its relationship to ecosystem services and ultimately to human well-being, given this assumption that BII connects to ecosystem functions, services, and human well-being. Can we start to probe some of those relationships? But we really hope that it will be used, pulled apart, interrogated, used in many different ways. And I would love to hear your feedback. So I will end there so that we still have some good time for discussion. And thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Hayley. That was wonderful actually to see the thought process that went into it, and the final product is really quite remarkable. So well done to you and your team for that.
Thanks, Dave.
I'm going to open the floor to questions. If people want to just raise their hands or pop something in the chat, we can have a little bit of a Q&A before we wrap up.
Yeah, I'd really love to hear people's thoughts, sticking points, etc. It would also maybe be nice to hear some reflections from some of the participating experts that have joined the call.
Well, maybe what I can do for the next couple of minutes while people are ruminating on what you said, I'm actually going to read the perceptions of the SAEON staff that were involved in the project. So Helga van der Merwe, this project was exciting for me as it brought together a large group of people with diverse expertise to get an improved assessment of the state of biodiversity in Africa. Africa is a research poor continent compared to the countries of the global north. It was interesting to experience how the various expert opinions got standardized in order to draw informed conclusions. Ryan Blanchard, I see this approach as a major step forward in improving biodiversity intactness indicators. The study is likely to increase confidence in the tool, and the BII is set to potentially play a larger role in shaping future policy and land use decisions. Jasper Slingsby, an honorary associate at Stellenbosch. For me, the key contribution of the approach adopted in this study is that it allowed a semi-quantitative synthesis of the ecosystem-specific impacts of a range of change drivers. This is key because each ecosystem responds in different ways. Mariska Tobias, who's an honorary associate at Grass and Wetland Forest Node. The loss of biodiversity worldwide is one of humanity's greatest current challenges. This study fills an important gap in our biodiversity knowledge of African ecosystems in particular that are generally underrepresented in global analyses. By providing greater understanding of the drivers of biodiversity loss and identifying areas with remaining biodiversity intactness, the study is fundamentally important to help decision-making to conserve Africa's precious biodiversity. So that's what the SAEON colleagues had to say, which I think is great, very inspirational.
Yeah, very nice. Thanks for sharing, Dave, and also for collating those. It's of course so nice for me to hear, people's reflections on the process and outcomes. Yeah.
Anyone? There's a hand. Sarah, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Thanks, Dave. Hi, Hayley. I had a question on how the experts made their estimates. Did they use data sets that they had compiled, or just like lived experience over time with what they've observed? So was there like quantitative data behind their estimates as well? And was it like varied across? So how did you see a lot of variance in experts and how they made their estimates?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think that's a great question, and it would actually be nice to open it to some of the experts on the floor that would like to share kind of how they did it. But I think, like Dave read in the beginning that I come from the social ecological systems space, and I think often data is seen as like the gold standard, like we need quant data.
Mm.
But to capture like the complexities of landscapes and how they impact people, like this kind of more social ecological dynamic, I think that the value of a person is that they can really weave that complexity of their understanding into their best guess estimate. And my sense was that, yeah, people, very much brought their whole of themselves and their experience, maybe also some quant data into that. I see Dan has his hand up. Hello, Dan. Nice
Yes.
of you to join. Thanks very much. So maybe you can tell us how you did it.
Thanks, Hayley. I was actually I was going to expressly not comment on how I did it, but now that you've put me on the spot, I'll say that my approach for the groups that I was involved in was to try and draw from those local contexts where I've been working, where my students have been working, and so that was you try really hard, but you're absolutely right. You can't use quantitative data in every single context and for every single component of the development of the index. So it was, trying to draw on that, and then using that kind of not thumb sucking, but best guess based on experience. So, I fully agree with you. I think that that's probably the real beauty in one of the key beauties of this BII that you and the core team have developed with all the experts is being able to harness through the crazy herding of cats that you did that those kind of nuanced what's your gut feel? In birding, the guys talk about a general impression, size, and shape. And I recall some of those workshops listening to people who are still kind of mentors in the field going, I'm really struggling to put my finger on this here because this is a difficult concept to get my head around. So yeah, I think it's captured a lot of that. And I want to stop waffling and ask you what I was going to ask you. And that's, what are your thoughts for how to mainstream the BRI even more, getting it into the Sustainable Development Goals and so on. What are your thoughts? I'm not one of those kind of stone throwers going, why aren't you doing it? I mean, how do you think we as a collective working within our various fields can try and champion to get this moving forward into those policy spaces, because I think that's a key next step. Obviously, all the maps and that's flipping awesome, but we want those politicians to be using those. I think, as you said in the beginning, for their decision making. So I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. First for the reflections, which were very nice, and I remember, Dan was part of the large mammal group where there was a revolt, and they said we're going to do this at species level. There's like 100 large herbivores, and they felt like we can do it for each one. So we actually have in the BII for Africa data set, it's at species level for large mammals. But yeah, so nice to hear your reflections. But I think that's such a good question and something I think about a lot. And I think so. Some thoughts. The one is that I think this ongoing work we're now doing in South Africa, which is taking the BII for Africa, like your data, the expert data set, and our approach, but saying we can actually own this we've got our, and I think there might be some people from Zambia on the call, but they've got like the data sets that they curate that go into the National Biodiversity Assessment, that go into the National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan that informs policy. And South Africa, of course, we all know is really like a champion around the world in mainstreaming biodiversity into policy. But in South Africa, we've actually really struggled with ecosystem condition, and so far we've actually just done it looking at per ecosystem type, like how much of that is transformed or not. So I think, that process now of working with Sandy to say, like, how do we actually embed this into your work streams and ultimately, hopefully, into your national biodiversity assessment is like a pathway to policy at a national scale. And I mean, it would be wonderful to do that in other countries as well, either with the product we've already produced or something where they can actually take ownership of it and like even, you know, downscale it even more for their purposes. That's the one thing. And the other thing is that, you know, for example, the BII is actually, it's in GeoBon as one of like the global map of BII, and the indicator is there, and it's actually being used by the task force on nature-related risk disclosures that companies now, especially in the EU, are being asked to report on, and you know, we hope that we get more of that around the world. But I mean, that to me is like terrifying. I mean, it's a wonderful initiative, TNFD, but they're using Newbolt's BII, which like doesn't make any, imagine that. So now countries are assessing their risk and impact on nature based on that map. So, you know, I think the more we can have exposure to you know, so I guess also to your question of like, what can we all do? I think, you know, there's kind of pushback to say like, if you believe in my map, which maybe you don't all, but I like to think it's at least better than the global one. You know, here is something that came out of Africa for Africa that you should rather use in those kinds of spaces. So, you know, I think there is kind of a bigger demand globally for this. You know, of course, it goes into the global biodiversity framework reporting and things like that. But even, you know, that example of like how companies might use this, you know, I think we really need to get products that we hopefully feel are at least more legitimate than these global ones out there into those spaces. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Hayley. Any other questions or hands? I do see in the chat there's a comment from Mike Peel. We'll just read that quickly. It says, thanks for a wonderful refresher and exciting prospect going forward. Outstanding work, Hayley. The measurement of biodiversity is daunting, so the general monitoring that takes place in the various landscapes becomes useful and a good basis for further biodiversity assessment. But then he raises the point that maybe we should be thinking about something like an irreplaceability index to kind of overlay on what has already been done. I think that's quite a neat idea. Thinking about the irreplaceability of
maybe respond to that. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think, yeah, thanks, Mike. And Mike was also involved. It's an interesting question because the BII is, because it's relative to what would have been there, it doesn't privilege, for example, more biodiverse parts of the continent or things like that. So it's kind of one tool that tells you like how intact is this relative to what it would have been. But absolutely you could layer on other things like species richness or something to start to get at irreplaceability, or, you know, of an ecosystem that has low intactness, for example, then the bits that are intact become much more important. So absolutely, like the BI can't do that by itself, but I think it's nice to think of it as a tool to be able to help with those kind of assessments.
Thanks, Hayley. Ryan, you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, hi Hayley, well done.
Hi, Ryan.
Thanks for a cool presentation. So there was a couple of points that it raised, but I'm just going to ask one. So since you're working with SANBI, you know, the South African land cover map gets generated
Yes.
quite regularly, so you're able to pick up trends, change over time. So at the African continent scale, I think that map was quite cool to see. So yeah, is there any idea to rerun the land cover map at that scale to see trends in particular locations and to identify tipping points, etc., etc.? But yeah, I just thought I'd highlight that one thing. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Good questions, and yeah, lovely to see you on the call. Ryan was part of the first workshop of this when we were trying to figure out, like, oh my gosh, I got the grant. What do we do? And it's also involved in the data paper. So so absolutely. I mean, for this to really be useful, it needs to be temporal, and so to the point about South Africa, that is very much the intention, is that because that land cover map gets updated, and if we can, you know, work with SANBI to build these workflows, Then every time there's a new land cover map, we can update it and we can go historically. The difficulty, even in South Africa, is that we have to layer in, land cover doesn't tell you everything you need to know in untransformed systems. You need to understand intensity. So we're drawing on other data sets that Zambi's collated on levels of degradation, but they're having the same problem, like those are not temporal. So we can do it to some extent, but not completely. In terms of the data across the continent, like also initially I was like, oh, we can do this over time in this project, but then just building one land use map was so hard. But absolutely, like the workflows are open access, and the idea is that when those data sets get updated, you could run the whole thing again and update it. But for example, the gridded livestock of the world data hasn't been updated since 2010. So, data limitations are still a limitation to this project. But yes, absolutely. Like that is where we need to get to, is to get to like not just temporal, but, ideally over quite short time scales to be able to capture this much more dynamically. And then you can ask a lot more interesting questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hayley. Are you able to see the comments in the chat, Hayley?
Let me look.
Or shall I read them to you? Either way is fine.
Yes,
Or,
I can see them. Okay, so there's a question here on the red list.
Mhm.
Yes, so red list, okay, two ways to answer that. Red list data was used in the paper in the sense of the IUCN red list distribution maps for vertebrates were used to tell us where things are so that we could then overlay our expert estimates of how those things have been impacted. So we used it to that extent, but then we also used it as a validation in terms of the threat levels. We just did a check to see whether what we like the level of intactness we were saying for different groups of species within their distribution, like what is the BII for that group of species, does that correspond with its threat level? And we saw there's again a lot of variability, but certainly a trend that as things are more threatened, they have a lower BII, or the other way around. Yes, so we used it in those two ways. And then this comment by Mary, challenges you came across. Oh, so many challenges. We only have 5 minutes. Yes, okay, so I think like to answer the last one first, these are all great questions, but the scale is, I think, a really important one. Like the BII is a landscape scale thing, because we needed to ask experts to imagine a landscape complete with the dynamics you'd expect in that landscape, like a smallholder cropland or an intensive rangeland or a city. It doesn't make sense for them to estimate, for example, like a nice little patch of fynbos in someone's back garden in suburbia, So they have to think it like a landscape scale, which means it would be inappropriate to try use this map at a very local scale. So this is not like a fine scale land use mapping tool. This is a high level understanding of the trends that we're seeing. And we try to make that quite clear in the paper, but I do worry that people might use it for the wrong things. So that's that is a very important question to ask. Validation was such a headache. I mean, I'd be really interested if people can come up with other creative ways to validate it. Besides, my hope is that, and this does seem to be happening now, I've had various people tell me they want to go and like test this in different landscapes for different groups of species. I think that would be great. Because validation is really hard, like at the scale, how do you know that this is right? Besides those general correlations that I mentioned that seem promising. Building a Google Earth engine up, G10 Sing did that for me. I think another thing maybe just to reflect on in this, project of this scale and extent, like I could have absolutely not done this alone. Like I don't have expertise in most of the things that were needed to produce this, like the expert knowledge of biodiversity, and that's how it's changing, but also like the technical abilities to construct these maps and these apps, etc. So this, was really like a huge team effort of many hours of many people's time to make this happen.
Great, thank you. And I see there's a comment from Johan Po, our original MD, just commenting that this is great African work and very useful. So that's great.
Nice to see. Johan, I see.
Johan, yes. Johan, go ahead.
Hi, Johan.
Hi, Hayley. Congratulations. It's a lovely piece of work.
Thank
I just
you.
wanted to quickly, and I missed the first part, I'm sorry, so you might have covered this, but the Natural History Museum here in the UK has its
Yes.
own Biodiversity Intactness Index.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering how this could be distinguished and how it can be made clear which one is which.
Yes, you missed the first bit where I put up a big picture of theirs and said spot the problem.
Okay.
But that was, I mean, I appreciate that having this conversation because, also when we wrote this paper initially, I was very nervous to like really critique some of those global products. And I think that my understanding is that the Natural History Museum one has come a long way since Newbold. The one that Newbold produced is, I think, very wrong for Africa. If you go look in the paper, we've got a figure where we compare that one and ours, and they almost are like the antithesis of each other. And I have my kind of, I won't go again through the reasons why I think that is. I gather they've been trying to improve it. But I don't have a good answer for how, that's obviously a global one and ours isn't, but I do feel like ours is quite a lot stronger for Africa for all the reasons that we talked through. So, I don't know what the answer to that question is, and I would very much welcome your thoughts, because again, the purpose wasn't to initially we didn't want to really hammer those products, but I do think there are like some quite big problems in how they're done.
I think it's an important issue to get on top of because there are more and more indices being developed and a lot of interest. So here at the Institute of Zoology, we produced a Living Planet Index. And that's a totally separate index again. And it's constantly coming under criticism because people can always find exceptions. And people love to say that the outliers prove that it doesn't work. And so it goes on. And so people are saying, this index is better than that one, and so on and so forth. And when I talk about the BII that you led, a lot of folks here get totally confused with the one that the NHM have got.
Yeah, understandable.
So I think it's an issue that's worth trying to get on top of.
Yeah. And I wonder what I mean, I know we're not going to solve this in a minute, but I'd love to chat to you a bit more about it. I didn't actually realize that was where you were based. Because, it would be nice to think through how that could be done. Because obviously, the advantage of this is that it's global. And this is the whole thing. Like, people need, these standardized things across the world. But what we're kind of saying is like, wow, it's really hard to do that well. So we've taken a regional approach, and here's what we've produced for the region. But how could it slot in? Like, I'd love to brainstorm that a bit more. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks,
and
Ryan.
thanks for your contributions as well.
Thank you.
To the map,
Thanks, John. No other questions in the chat. Anyone got a burning question before we wrap up? Okay, doesn't look like it. Just my sort of final comments, Hayley. I think this is so relevant, like obviously for SAEON, there's so much pressure or need now to be sort of impactful and have relevance, and this is so relevant to SAEON and FDION and everyone on this call, and honestly anyone who's working like in the national system of innovation, like everybody should be thinking along these lines. I think it's really powerful. And so I just want to remind everybody in the beginning of the chat, I put a bunch of links. Those are the links to the 2 papers that came out of the BII work, and also those 2 resources that Hayley produced, the Handbook of Research Methods for Social Ecological Systems, and the chapter Social Ecological Systems, Thinking and Biodiversity. And I think if you haven't read all that, then you should put it on your reading list. And then make it part of your prescribed reading for the next couple of weeks, because it's really critical for everybody.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you everybody for the wonderful engagement and this opportunity. I've really enjoyed it and really appreciate it.
Thanks, Hayley. We're very grateful for your time. Just before we wrap up, just to advertise our next SAEON Seminar Series presentation. It's scheduled for the 2nd of July. The presenter is Dr. Jonathan Muller. He's a postdoc at the Fynbos node. He is going to be talking on fire as a catalyst for carbon sequestration, using data coming from the Jonkershoek flux tower. So put that in your diaries, and we look forward to hearing about that. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.